Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Matt Rhule, the Nebraska Cornhuskers, continuing to work their way through spring practice. And this was a particular program that I was extremely excited to kind of monitor during spring practice. And, the national media will make a really big deal about year three Matt Rhule teams. And look, the history backs it up, right? Year three for Matt Rhule is normally when you see these programs start taking off, but nobody ever talks about why. Why is it that year three always seems to be the year for Matt Rhule? I think I know the answer, or at least I know part of the answer, and that is how he builds his roster. He's going to load it up with developmental prospects, guys that are really good athletes, but maybe not necessarily ready to play year one, year two. And then come year three, after kind of building that strong foundation of really good athletes on your roster, that's when normally those really good athletes from the high school ranks who maybe didn't play a ton year one, year two, really start putting it together. And that's why spring practice for me was going to be so exciting for Nebraska, where there are a lot of guys that, came to Nebraska out of high school that were really good athletes. The Nebraska fans who rock with the boys as we break down the commitments in the summer, we talk about it all the time. Like Matt Rhule kind of prospects, guys that track and field backgrounds, three-sport athletes, maybe not necessarily the most polished football players, but guys that have some serious upside. Now it's their time to really capitalize on all that upside that Matt Rhule has stacked on this roster. And you're starting to hear some names that are, for lack of better terms, putting it together for Nebraska going into 2025. Want to get into some names that are exciting me the most. Both some new faces from the transfer portal, but also some guys that are kind of working their way up through the pipeline. Before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and to the Nebraska fans. It truly has been a blast. Talking this program really since Matt Rhule took it over, the amount of support that y'all have shown the boys has been amazing. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And I want to start with the transfer portal edition. I know I started this episode out talking about some developmental kids that we're going to talk about, but I do want to start off with a kid that I am extremely excited about going into 2025. That is Deshaun McCullough. And, why am I so excited about Deshaun? It goes back to the role he played for Indiana in the 2022 season. As a freshman in the Big Ten, really emerged as one of the more intriguing pass rushers in the conference as a freshman. And then after a big freshman year, decides to hit the transfer portal. He goes to Oklahoma, where they kind of used Deshaun McCullough in some puzzling ways. They put him at nickel for a little bit, then put him at will linebacker, and didn't really give him the chance to come off the edge and be a pass rusher. He's coming to Nebraska at jack linebacker spot on the edge, which in my opinion is a perfect fit for this kid. We know he can rush the passer. 14 quarterback hurries as a freshman at Indiana. Now he's getting put back in that spot where he can have, the success that we saw him have early during his career at Indiana. I think secondly, he's finally back healthy. Not only going to Oklahoma kind of playing out of position, that kind of contributed to the quiet last 2 years, but he also was dealing with a lot of injuries. A healthy Deshaun McCullough playing in the right position for Nebraska in 2025. That should excite a lot of Nebraska fans. And why should it excite the Nebraska fans? Because our one of our biggest question marks about this defense is the pass rush. Where's that pass rush production going to come from? Because you go back to 2024, a lot of the production came from the inside of that defensive line with a guy like Ty Robinson. It also came from a guy like Prince Will U. It also came from a guy like Jamari Butler, guys that are no longer with the program. We got to replace almost all of our pass rush production from the 2024 year. Well, guess what? Deshaun McCullough can really be that guy. And another name that I would certainly monitor, and I know Nebraska fans are fired up about it, Willis McGahee. Look, he was one of those guys that we saw the light bulb flicker as a true freshman last year. Can that light bulb turn on for Willis McGahee going into the 2025 season? It's going to play a similar role with that Deshaun McCullough's going to play, but you got two guys that, hey, you're looking for pass rush production. Those two can provide it for Nebraska. And then the last one on the defensive line that I think is worth noting is Keona Davis, who just seeing a picture of him in spring practice has me fired up. This was a guy coming out of high school from the state of Arizona that, was really long, was a really fluid athlete, but kind of came in around 240 pounds, maybe a little bit lighter. He was a guy that you knew would take a year to fill out that frame. That frame's filled out. And you look at one picture of this kid going into year 2, he's been putting some real time in the weight room. Now he's a big-bodied defensive lineman that not only has really good length, but it looks like the play strength is going to be there. And a guy that's probably a little bit more versatile. At times he can hang out on the edge. He also can play a little 3-tech. I would also take a look at, Williams Winery and a guy like Cam Lenhart, guys that can all do some similar things and have similar body types as we're I don't know if it's necessarily fair to say it's a concern right now, but you have some question marks about what this defensive line is going to look like when you have bodies like Keona Davis and like a guy like Williams Winery, who I think is pushing 270 right now, and a guy like Cam Lenhart, all guys that can play out on the edge, but also give you snaps on the inside. That goes a long way in kind of mitigating some of the concerns we might have about what this front seven, specifically the defensive line, is going to be. And also hearing some development from a guy like Dylan Parrott, who, was not a heralded recruit, I believe, from the state of Iowa, but he's a guy that he's a big body. Him and Riley Van Poppel are two guys that I thought Riley Van Poppel, quite frankly, should have played last year. They decided to redshirt him. You have some bodies that can replace some of the size that you're losing with a guy like Ty, that you're losing with a guy like Nash. But regardless, I think you're going to see a defensive line that maybe is not as big, but is going to be a little bit more athletic. And it kind of reminds me of how Penn State's defensive line was constructed in 2024, where they did not have a huge defensive line, especially on the inside, but they had a hyper athletic one and gave a lot of interior offensive linemen some problems with penetration. I think that's kind of the recipe Nebraska's looking at in the 2025 year as well. And that's not to say size does not matter. You need the big bodies, especially in the Big Ten Conference. I think you have those bodies, but you can win in a lot of different ways. And I think Nebraska's going to win with a little bit more length, a little bit more twitch and athleticism, create a little bit more negative plays. That seems to be the recipe where Nebraska's going. Another spring standout, and I know this is kind of low-hanging fruit, but I do want to talk about it because we talked about it a little bit, kind of want to check in here. Dylan, what was the big step that we set going into spring practice was, and look, this is not saying, hey, we got to watch this kid's weight. That's not what I'm trying to say. But the step that you wanted to see Dylan take from year 1 to year 2 was being a little bit more of an athlete at the quarterback position. And look, Dylan's never going to be Lamar Jackson. He's probably going to be a little bit more like Patty Mahomes or Josh Allen. And look, those quarterbacks, although they're really big, kind of like Dylan is, are really good kind of creating outside the pocket. And that's kind of the step you wanted to see Dylan make. Look, we know he can make every single throw on the football field. We know that he's one of the smartest quarterbacks that you see across the country, even as a true freshman. Like, this guy knows what he's looking at. He knows how to cut up a defense. I think the step you're looking for is, can you be a little bit more of a difference maker? Patty Mahomes and Josh Allen are big quarterbacks too, but they carry the weight well, and they're able to extend plays and be that. It's not necessarily dual threat, but a guy that if you are sloppy with your pass rush lanes or things start breaking down a little bit, they can be a quarterback that can get outside the pocket and make plays. If you get that from Dylan in 2025, being a little better at getting himself out of trouble, that's the step, because he checks off every other box. And I think you could see a massive step, and everything you're hearing is that he's taking it seriously and he's getting that body right. He's getting that athletic profile right to be that kind of quarterback. Last one I want to talk about, and I probably need to take back a statement I made when Elijah Pritchett committed to Nebraska. I was pretty hard on him, and some Nebraska fans didn't necessarily love what I had to say when he committed to Nebraska in the winter portal window. Look, Elijah Pritchett, former 5-star, and he's a former 5-star for a reason. At 6'6", 310 plus, he is a big body with 34-inch arms that carries the weight extremely well. The play on the field for him was a little bit sloppy, was a little bit inconsistent. And I still stand by that take. I think a lot of Nebraska fans who might have gone back and checked him out probably agree with that too. I was probably a little hard on him because the more I watch Alabama from the 2024 year, the more I kind of understand that Jalen Milroe did not do his tackles any favors. He was skittish in the pocket. He did not like to hang in the pocket very long. And when you have a quarterback that doesn't have great pocket presence, it starts putting a lot more pressure on your offensive tackles, and quite frankly, it just makes the tackles look bad. Going back and kind of further diving into not just Elijah Pritchett, this actually came about watching a different Alabama guy I wanted to check out. I kind of came to the consensus that Elijah Pritchett, yes, there is a lot of meat left on the bone. I think he can play significantly better for Nebraska in the 2025 year. Maybe that's just kind of a different coaching year and a change of scenery. But I think I was a little too hard on him and saying, hey, I don't think Jalen Milroe did him many favors in the 2024 year from a pocket presence standpoint, which made Elijah Pritchett probably look worse at times than it actually was. And from what you're hearing, Elijah Pritchett, it has looked good in spring practice for Nebraska. And that's kind of one of the things I'm most excited about is I know that Nebraska's a little bit banged up. They have some guys that probably will be factors in on the offensive line in the fall that are not practicing in spring. My biggest take was that this depth is real. And now Nebraska has a lot of depth. It has a lot of versatility on the offensive line that you can start playing around with. Hey, what's our best five looking like going into the fall? Where the first 2 years under Matt Rhule is like you kind of had to play what you had because you did not have a ton of versatility and depth. You have that going into 2025 with bodes well for putting out your best five. We'll close it out there. I think you're hearing some really good things. You're hearing some good things from the pass catchers as well, even with Harley Gilmore, leaving the program. You're hearing some good things from Nebraska going into 2025. And again, to emphasize it, the year 3 step for Matt Rhule, I think has to do with a lot of these really talented, really athletic kids taking that step as football players. We'll sign out there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.